Imagine a quiet, picturesque town in southeastern France, the kind of place where people greet each other by name, where neighbors chat over fences, and where life moves at a comfortable, predictable pace. Among its residents were Dominique and Gisèle Pelicot, a couple married since 1973. To the outside world, they were ordinary retirees living a peaceful existence. They had raised a family, built a life together, and now enjoyed the simple pleasures of old age. But how well do we really know the people around us? How much can someone hide behind closed doors? Because what no one realized was that Dominique Pelicot wasn't just an ordinary husband. He was hiding a monstrous secret, and it would take decades before the world finally saw the true face of the man now known as the Beast of Avignon. It all started with something that at first seemed almost insignificant. September 2020, a supermarket in Avignon. Dominique Pelicot was arrested for taking illicit photographs of women, an act disgusting, yes, but hardly something that would send shockwaves through an entire nation. At first, police believed they were dealing with nothing more than an old man with perverted tendencies, a voyeur maybe. But when they seized his computer, what they found was beyond anyone's worst nightmares. Thousands of photos and videos, not just of random women in public. No, what they uncovered was far more disturbing. They found footage of a woman drugged, unconscious, being assaulted repeatedly by multiple men. And that woman, his own wife, Gisèle. A crime so unthinkable that even hardened detectives struggled to comprehend what they were looking at. How long had this been going on? Who were these men? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, did she even know? The answer? No, she had no idea. For nearly a decade, from 2011 to 2020, Gisèle had been living in a horrifying reality without even knowing it. Every so often, she would experience strange symptoms, fatigue, memory loss, a lingering sense of confusion. She thought it was just aging, maybe stress, maybe something she ate. But the truth, she wasn't just tired, she was being drugged. She wasn't just sick, she was being assaulted. And she never knew. Because each time Dominique would slip a powerful sedative into her drink, wait for her to pass out, and then, behind closed doors, allow other men to violate her. And not just once, not just twice, but at least 72 different men over the course of a decade. 72. How does something like this go unnoticed for so long? How did no one suspect a thing? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how many more victims could there be? Who were these men? Were they criminals lurking in the shadows? Violent offenders with long rap sheets? Predators already on law enforcement's radar? No, they were nurses, civil servants, firefighters, men who, on the surface, seemed respectable, trusted members of society. The kind of people you'd never suspect of something so vile. And yet, behind closed doors, they willingly participated in a crime so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to process the full horror of it. But how did they get involved? Dominique Pelicot had an entire system in place. He used online platforms, private forums, encrypted chat groups to seek out like-minded men. Men who were looking for something unspeakable. He told them he had the perfect victim, a woman who would never resist, never remember, never be able to testify. And they came to him, one by one. Over the years, at least 72 different men crossed that threshold, walking into the Pelicot home with the full knowledge that Gisèle was incapacitated and unable to consent. They did it knowing she was unconscious. They did it knowing she had no say. They did it because they knew they could get away with it, or so they thought. When the truth finally came out, Gisèle's world shattered. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the life you thought you were living was a lie. That the man you trusted, the man you loved, had betrayed you in the most horrifying way imaginable. That for nearly a decade, your body had been used, violated, and desecrated, and you had no memory of it. How do you even begin to process something like that? Many victims in her position might have disappeared from public view, retreating into the shadows, unable to face the weight of such trauma. But Gisèle, she refused to stay silent. She waived her right to anonymity. She spoke out. She stood in court face to face with the men who had done this to her. And she didn't just fight for herself, she became a symbol of strength for survivors everywhere. She wanted the world to know the truth. She wanted the world to see the faces of these men. She wanted justice, and she was about to get it. The trial that followed wasn't just another court case. It was one of the most significant trials in French history. 51 men stood accused alongside Dominique Pelicot. 51. The details that emerged in court were so graphic, so deeply disturbing, that at one point the judge considered closing the courtroom to the public. But Gisèle, she wouldn't allow it. She insisted that the trial remain open for all to see. She wanted people to witness what had happened to her. She wanted society to confront the reality of these crimes. And so the world watched as the evidence was laid bare, as Dominique's decades of deception unraveled before the court, as the faces of once respected men were exposed for who they truly were. And when the verdicts finally came down, justice was served. But was it enough? After months of legal battles, December 2024 finally brought justice. But was it enough? Dominique Pelicot, the man who orchestrated this decade-long nightmare, was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum penalty allowed by French law. 20 years. Is that enough for what he did? For the sheer depth of betrayal? For the lives he shattered? And what about the 51 other men who stood trial alongside him? Their sentences varied. Some received 3 years, others 15, depending on their level of involvement. Some were convicted of direct sexual violence, while others were charged as accomplices. But here's the question we all have to ask. Does time behind bars truly bring justice in a case like this? Can any sentence make up for what Gisèle endured? Or is this one of those cases where, no matter the punishment, it will never feel like enough? Now that the trial is over, you might think the case is closed. But is it? Or are we just scratching the surface? Let's take a step back. How did this happen for nearly a decade without anyone noticing? Did no one see the warning signs? Did no one ever question why a seemingly normal woman was constantly dazed, fatigued, or disoriented? Did Gisèle ever try to tell someone? And if she did, was she ignored? And here's the most disturbing question of all. Could there be more victims? Dominique was caught by accident, a routine arrest for taking photos in a supermarket. If that had never happened, how much longer would he have continued? And if he had access to so many men through hidden online networks, could this be part of something bigger, something even more sinister? Or is this case just one horrifying anomaly? These are questions we may never have answers to, and maybe that's the most terrifying part. So let's talk about the mind of a predator. What kind of person is capable of orchestrating something so evil? Was Dominique Pelicot simply a monster born without empathy, or was he created over time? Experts say predators like him thrive on three things: power, the ability to control others, to manipulate, to make them feel small; deception, the ability to maintain a facade, to hide in plain sight; lack of remorse, the absence of guilt, the complete inability to see victims as people; Dominique's actions weren't impulsive, they were meticulously planned. For nearly a decade, he knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't just drug his wife, he documented it. He didn't just allow other men to abuse her, he recruited them. He built a system, carefully orchestrated every detail, and lived his life without an ounce of shame. Does that sound like a man who regrets his actions? Or does it sound like someone who believed he would never be caught? So here's a chilling thought. What if he hadn't been? Imagine waking up one day and discovering that your father, the man who raised you, protected you, and shaped your childhood, wasn't just a criminal, but one of the most monstrous predators in modern history. How do you even begin to process that? The Pelicot children were forced to confront a truth so horrifying, so unimaginable, that it shattered everything they thought they knew about their family. In court, their testimonies revealed the profound toll this case had taken on them. One of them described it as feeling like their entire past had been rewritten. "I used to think I had a normal childhood," one of them said. "Now I wonder, was there ever a time when he wasn't like this?" The hardest part? They weren't just mourning the loss of the father they once loved, they were being forced to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, he had been a monster all along. And the question that lingers, did they ever suspect anything? Did they ever notice their mother's unexplained illnesses, her frequent exhaustion, the moments of confusion she couldn't explain? And if they did, could they have done something? Or were they too manipulated into believing that everything was normal? One thing is certain, this family will never be whole again. This case doesn't just expose one predator. It forces us to confront something much deeper. Because the truth is, this didn't happen in isolation. This case is a reflection of a larger issue, one that has existed for centuries. The systemic objectification of women, the silencing of victims, the willingness of men, 72 of them in this case, to dehumanize and destroy without remorse. And the worst part, these men weren't lurking in dark alleyways. They weren't career criminals with long rap sheets. They were firefighters, nurses, civil servants, men society trusts, men who, when presented with an opportunity for power, control, and violence, took it. And it raises a deeply disturbing question. How many more are out there? How many more men walking among us would do the same thing if they thought they could get away with it? And more importantly, how do we stop them? Because if cases like this tell us anything, it's that monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes they wear uniforms. But here's something even more terrifying: technology made this possible. Dominique didn't just find accomplices, he recruited them. Where? The internet. Hidden online forums, encrypted chat rooms, private messaging apps. A whole network of predators thriving in the shadows, exchanging messages, planning their crimes, and ensuring they could operate in plain sight without getting caught. And this isn't just an isolated case. Time and time again, we've seen how digital anonymity enables the worst kinds of criminals: human traffickers, child predators, serial rapists, and in this case, a husband turned monster who used the internet to turn his wife into prey. So here's the real question. How many more crimes like this are happening right now, hidden behind screens, buried in encrypted messages, just waiting to be discovered? And if law enforcement is struggling to track them down, how do we fight back? When a case like this comes to light, it forces an uncomfortable question. Are the laws strong enough? Because let's be honest, 20 years for Dominique Pelicot doesn't feel like justice. Not for 10 years of premeditated abuse. Not for 72 men who participated. And if a man can get only 2 decades for orchestrating something this horrific, what does that say about the system meant to protect victims? This case has sparked intense debates in France about legal reforms. Some argue that sentences for sexual crimes should be harsher, especially when the victim is drugged and unable to resist. Others point out the lack of oversight on digital platforms where predators can operate freely until they're caught by chance. And then there's the even bigger issue. How do you prevent something like this from happening again? Should there be stricter monitoring of online abuse networks? Should law enforcement have better tools to track predatory behavior? Or is the problem even deeper, a society that lets predators hide in plain sight? One thing is certain: if the system doesn't change, another Dominique Pelicot will rise again. From the moment this case broke, it dominated headlines across France and beyond. Every news outlet wanted the story. Every detail was dissected. Every horrific revelation became front page material. But with that level of media attention comes a difficult question. Where's the line between raising awareness and turning a tragedy into entertainment? For Gisèle, the exposure was both a weapon and a curse. On one hand, she used it to take control of the narrative, to force the world to confront what had been done to her. But on the other, the relentless media coverage meant she could never escape it. Every time she turned on the TV, every time she scrolled through social media, there it was, her trauma repackaged and retold. And then there's the sensationalism. Some tabloids focused more on the number of men involved than the crime itself. Others twisted the story to create clickbait horror, stripping the reality away in favor of shock value. So, how does the media walk the line between truth and exploitation? How do we make sure that cases like this aren't just fodder for headlines, but actually lead to change? Or is society too addicted to tragedy to care about what happens after the cameras turn off? When the full extent of Dominique Pelicot's crimes was revealed, France erupted. People were horrified. Social media exploded with rage. Survivors of sexual violence shared their own stories. Protests broke out in multiple cities, demanding harsher punishments for rapists and better protections for victims. And then there were the vigils. In Paris, hundreds gathered in silence, holding candles in honor of Gisèle and every other victim who never got justice. But here's the thing: public outrage is powerful, but is it enough? How many times have we seen this before? A shocking crime, a wave of fury, calls for reform. And then nothing changes. So the real question is, will this time be different? Or will Gisèle's pain just become another story that people forget the moment the next tragedy takes over the headlines? Surviving is one thing, healing is another. For Gisèle, the battle didn't end with Dominique's arrest. It didn't even end with the trial. Because trauma like this doesn't just disappear, it lingers. It shapes every thought, every interaction, every moment. So here's the question: what happens to victims after the headlines fade? Gisèle's case underscores something critical: survivors need support. Counseling. The emotional and psychological toll of such trauma is immeasurable. Survivors need access to therapy without barriers, without stigma. Legal assistance. Many victims struggle to navigate the legal system. Who helps them understand their rights? Who fights for them in court? Community support. Survivors often feel isolated, ashamed, or disbelieved. Stronger networks, support groups, survivor-led organizations can be the difference between recovery and suffering in silence. But here's the harsh reality: in many places, these systems don't exist. Or if they do, they're underfunded, inaccessible, or buried in bureaucracy. So how do we change that? How do we make sure every survivor has the resources they need, not just to survive, but to rebuild? Because if cases like this prove anything, it's that justice isn't just about punishing criminals. It's about helping the victims live again. This happened in France, but could it happen anywhere? Absolutely. Cases like this aren't limited to one country, one culture, or one legal system. From the United States to Japan, from Brazil to Australia, the pattern is disturbingly familiar. A predator operates in secret. Society fails to recognize the warning signs. Justice, when it comes, feels inadequate. The details change, the names change, but the story? It happens everywhere. And that should terrify us. So, what can other countries learn from this case? Stronger laws, harsher sentences for crimes involving drugging and incapacitation, more proactive policing, targeting the dark web, encrypted platforms, and hidden networks where predators operate, better education, teaching people, not just women, but everyone, about consent, red flags, and the realities of predatory behavior. Because if there's one thing we should all take away from this case, it's this: evil doesn't have borders, so neither should our fight against it. What do we as a society take away from a tragedy like this? Because let's be honest, if we don't learn from it, then what was the point? Here's what this case teaches us. Consent education is non-negotiable. If society doesn't teach people, especially men, about true consent, then cases like this will keep happening. Victims need to be believed. How many people doubted Gisèle at first? How many survivors never come forward because they fear no one will listen? Abuse thrives in silence. Pelicot got away with this for a decade because no one was looking. The biggest weapon against abuse: awareness, exposure, accountability. And the final lesson: it's up to all of us. Laws can change, investigations can improve, but at the end of the day, it's people, neighbors, friends, family who make the difference, who pay attention, who ask questions, who refuse to let abusers hide in plain sight. Because if this case proves anything, it's this: ignoring the problem is what lets monsters like Dominique Pelicot exist. After everything, after the arrests, the trial, the headlines, the outrage, what comes next? Because here's the truth: stories like this don't end with a verdict. For survivors like Gisèle, the battle never truly ends. But amidst the darkness, there is something powerful emerging: hope. Her bravery has ignited something in others. More survivors are speaking out. Some who have lived in silence for years are finally coming forward. Advocacy groups are growing. More organizations are fighting for victims' rights, pushing for tougher laws, demanding real change. Communities are becoming more vigilant. People are recognizing the warning signs. Conversations about consent, abuse, and digital safety are taking center stage. And while the scars of this case will never fully fade, what Gisèle did, standing up, fighting back, refusing to be silent, will ripple far beyond her own story. Because now there is no more hiding, no more silence. And for every abuser who thinks they can get away with it, there's a growing army of voices saying, not anymore. So here's where I leave you with a question, one that might be uncomfortable, but one that matters. What are you going to do? Because cases like this don't just exist in true crime documentaries. They don't just happen in faraway places. They happen everywhere, and they thrive when people look the other way. So how can each of us make a difference? Stay informed, learn the signs of abuse, teach others, never assume it's not my problem. Speak up. If something feels off, if someone seems trapped, silenced, afraid, ask questions. Support survivors. Listen. Believe them. Help them access the resources they need. Because change doesn't happen in courtrooms alone. It happens when people decide to stop being bystanders. And maybe, just maybe, Gisèle's fight won't have been in vain. Thank you for joining me in this deep dive into a case that shakes our perceptions, challenges our sense of justice, and demands action. Let's keep this conversation going. Like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, monsters hide in plain sight, but together we can drag them into the light.